This election is a choice.
This election will determine whether we can come together.
This election is absolutely crucial.
What's really important, of course, is
12 I sent a giant 303 rifle.
Please explain.
You're listening to the 4ZZZ Breaks the Election podcast.
Hello election watchers and welcome to the 4ZZZ Breaks the Election podcast, where our newsroom breaks down what's happening in the election for May 12th, 2022. Just 9 full campaigning days until the federal election. My name is Alexis Pink, I'm the news coordinator at 4ZZZ, and joining us as always is the 4ZZZ newsroom.
Hello, I'm Tim. I'm studying science and journalism at UQ.
Hi, I'm Bianca and I'm studying journalism and law at QUT.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm studying journalism and arts at UQ.
On today's podcast, Frydenberg talks up an ICAC, the Greens Humanitarian Intake, Albanese clears up his take on wages, and the Young LNP declares a winner in the latest debate. Okay, let's start at the top. What's happening with Josh Frydenberg and the ICAC, Catherine?
Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg has said this morning the coalition is committed to a federal ICAC under the right model. Despite not putting forward a bill during his term, Scott Morrison has assured voters during the debate last night that it remains a priority for the coalition. This comes after the government refuses to release information on a $500,000 payout to Alan Tudge's former staffer Rochelle Miller. Labor has accused the lack of transparency as an act of contempt against the Australian public, as Morrison confirms that Tudge will return to the government as the Education Minister if the coalition is re-elected.
Why is the coalition so worried about introducing an ICAC at the federal level?
Well, I think especially when they saw in New South Wales with Gladys last year, it's just clearly not the route they want to go down. And it's really funny argument to prosecute that the Australians don't want to see politicians held in that account, when I think if you ask the majority of Australians whether good or bad, they don't really see politicians as human people and empathetic people to start with. So to see them kind of get trialled, even by the media, like Scott Morrison always says in the case of New South Wales, people don't really see that as a bad thing, I think, which is a very kind of funny argument to keep prosecuting.
They don't see them as empathetic human beings, whether that's fair or not.
Yeah.
I think it's important to mention a lot of what was mentioned last night by Mr. Morrison at the debate, where he said that Liberal had their own inquest into the whole Trudge and Miller situation, which makes it seem like they want to control what is basically said about their government and how they control the workings within the government. So if they have a federal ICAC, it places another limitation on to what they can do and achieve and operate.
So Rochelle Miller was quite critical of that PMO investigation into the Tudge affair.
Yes, and that was also mentioned last night, where Mr. Morrison said that she did not allow them to investigate, and that was her right as a human. So it does show that even though Liberal thinks that they are handling things the way that they should be handled, there are many limitations to their current strategy.
Let's move on to the next thing. Let's talk about the Greens and their asylum seeker pledges. Tim, what's going on?
Yep, so today Greens leader Adam Bandt has announced a pledge to increase Australia's humanitarian intake to 50,000 people a year, as well as abolishing Australia's border force. The decision would see a dramatic increase from the current intake of 13,750 people a year, seen in the 2020 to 21 period. Bandt described the idea as a fair and empathetic approach to refugee intake, stating the Greens will push to close the camps, end offshore detention, and create a fair and humane immigration system. When people come to here fleeing war and seeking help, we should offer them an open hand, not a closed fist. Australia is currently ranked 26th in the world by annual humanitarian intake, behind other developed countries like America, Canada, and the UK.
Changes in immigration policy are usually quite toxic during elections, especially after, effectively, the Tampa affair sort of poisoned the well on immigration policy. Why would the Greens choose to bring this up?
Well, obviously, I think it's just a way to distance yourself from the two major parties. But it's also the reason which I think it may gain a little bit of attraction in this election, particularly, is we've heard so much from both Labor and the Liberals about the drop in productivity, ways to increase that up, and a lack in the workforce and labour force to start with. So maybe increasing that immigration or humanitarian intake is not so toxic as it could have been if you had this share of the labour market that needs to be filled urgently.
What's the economics behind a decision like this? What can Australians expect out of a higher migration rate?
Well, I think what's quite interesting to note that sits a bit outside Australia's own policy, but in terms of Jacinda Ardern announcing that New Zealand in July will be welcoming back skilled workers into New Zealand, which I think is somewhat relevant to us, because that's very similar to immigration in terms of what people bring in the workforce. We are currently facing a shortage of nurses and doctors, and that is definitely something that New Zealand is facing, and we should follow that.
A big problem with our current caring workforce is that it is very transient. It's very in and out, and especially in aged care, that's actually a real problem for the mental well-being of patients. So to be able to see less so sort of seasonal migration and more long-term migration, we might be able to remedy that problem, especially if we're bringing in skilled workers.
So, a little bit more happening with Labor's promise to lift minimum wages from the debate?
Recap on some things that were mentioned by Mr. Albanese last night. So regarding minimum wage, Mr. Albanese said he was shocked that both parties couldn't come to consensus and would support a Fair Work Commission. And that's really important, especially in government, regardless of who's in power, that the two need to work together. So Mr. Albanese proposed that he would like to see a lift of minimum wage by 5.1% with the rising cost of living, which means that the minimum wage would potentially raise by $1 an hour. So the current rate is $20.33. And Mr. Albanese compared his proposed minimum wage increase to allow Australians on a minimum wage an extra cup of coffee. He said, quote, "That's 2 cups of coffee a day." So the idea that a cup of coffee would be able to help people on minimum wage was quite interesting. However, it came across a little bit unclear. He somewhat jumped into the current rate to 2 cups of coffee, which left out a bit of the context about why that would lead to an extra cup of coffee in terms of an extra $1 an hour. When Mr. Albanese was attacked by Mr. Morrison when he called him a loose unit when it comes to the economy and that he makes things up as he go, Albanese responded by saying that it's the most experienced incoming Labor government in history, that he has been Deputy Prime Minister and on occasion acted as Prime Minister. And voters from the pub test were also very happy to back Albanese because he came across as a man who left no man behind.
Don't you just love Morrison's turns of phrase on some of these things? Loose unit?
It's just like trying so hard to just seem, as one of the fellas or just someone so relatable. Like, it's just, what person would ever use that in a formal discussion or anyone? It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Dishing out Twitter hashtags, basically,
literally,
in a formal, prime ministerial debate. It's unique.
I watched it live and I could not stop laughing. He was like, he's a use lunate. Like, it was comedic, actually, just in terms of this is how he's playing politics.
Yeah, and it sort of goes into that Morrison brand of being, just an average guy who just happens to run the country. It's very odd. Let's move on, shall we? Last thing for the day. So, we have to talk about the Young Libs, do we?
Yes.
Okay, go for it.
So, in a surprise call, the Young Libs have announced via their socials that Scott Morrison has, in fact, won last night's debate. In a post captioned, "Scomentum," and featuring the current Prime Minister adorned in puppies, they turned a positive face to next week's polls. The posts were met with a lot of backlash, in light of the official result placing Albanese as the victor, winning 50% of Wednesday night's audience, made up of marginal voters. Morrison, comparatively, pulled 34% of voters, but still 16% remained undecided after the decidedly tamer final leaders debate.
Oh boy. Oh my gosh. The Young LNP just having a little bit of trouble with how things are going in this election, I have a feeling.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah, the polls haven't been particularly good. The leaders' debates have mostly been either mixed or pro-Albanese in terms of results.
I think it's quite telling, though, that after 3 debates, we still have 16% on the fence, and especially after what was, a better presented, perhaps, debate, one where we actually heard policies read out.
It's not unusual to have people turn up to a polling booth without a specific vote in mind. 1 in 5 is actually not too far off the sort of estimation of how many people go to a polling booth, we could be getting up to the point where a solidification of the results is happening, and if you were Scott Morrison and watching the polls, you would be very, very concerned about that outcome. Okay, so that's about all the time that we've got for the podcast this week. Thank you for listening to the 4ZZZ Breaks the Election podcast. For more news, head to 4ZZZ.org.au/news or listen to 4ZZZ on 102.1 FM, on DAB Plus digital radio, via the 4ZZZ website, or on your favourite podcasting app. If you have a tip-off or feedback about the show, please email us, newsroom@4ZZZ.org.au, and if you would like to support our projects here at 4ZZZ, go to 4ZZZ.org.au/support and subscribe or make a donation today. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.